So you know that joke that we all like to throw around, that reading is a separate hobby from purchasing books? Well, as you know, I've been in a reading slump for the past 6 months or so. That has not stopped me from buying new books. Anyway, seeing as we recently caught up on all of the books that I have managed to read in the last 6 months, I thought it was about time that we caught up on a bunch of the books that I've been buying the last 6 months. Yep, that's right. You've clicked on a good old-fashioned book haul. And up here on the top of the pile, we have The Sunforge, which is, of course, the sequel to The Dawnhounds. This is the book that I'm reading with my Patreon this month, actually. We read The Dawnhounds a couple of years ago. And honestly, this book is a little convoluted. There's a lot going on, so I can't tell you that I remember everything. In fact, I probably should reread this before I get to the new one. But essentially, some of the keywords that I would throw out to you are a queer Maori-inspired sci-fi that's an anti-cop romp, and also there's pirates. I remember this not being a perfect book, but it was a really, really fun one to read. And so obviously I was so thrilled that my patrons were just as excited as I was to get stuck into the new book. It says on the back here that this is the second book in what is going to be a trilogy. And I'm honestly a little bit nervous, but also just like really excited to dive into this very unique world. Next up is probably my most anticipated book of the year, if I'm being honest. It is Daughter of the Merciful Deep by Lesley Penelope. If you remember last year, I think it ended up being my second favorite book of the year was Lesley Penelope's previous book, The Monsters We Defy. That is like a historical fantasy set in like the 1920s in Washington. It's just incredible. It was so good. The only thing that I didn't like about it was the fact that it was a standalone and there was nothing else for me to read. But Lesley has now come out with another book. It's not a sequel or anything. It has nothing to do with The Monsters We Defy. But after how much I loved that book, you know I was excited about this one. Like The Monsters We Defy, this one is also an historical fantasy that centers Black people. I think there was only one named white character in The Monsters We Defy. Daughter of the Merciful Deep is a compelling historical fantasy that shines light on the drowned Black towns of the American South as Jane discovers the power of her ancestors, her family, and her home. I just loved like the world building, the storytelling, the characters. Honestly, I would be hard pressed to name something I didn't like about The Monsters We Defy. It genuinely was a true favorite for me. So I'm just thrilled. I'm thrilled to have a new Lesley Penelope, a new historical fantasy by this author in my hands. And I'm hoping I'm going to be out of my reading slump sooner rather than later so I can finally dive in. And who knows, we might have a new favorite on our hands. Another highly anticipated book for me this year was Goddess of the River. This is the new book by the author of KKE, which was another of my favorite books last year. And I wouldn't really describe that as historical fantasy as such. It's more like a mythological retelling. And it seems like this is going to be another retelling along a similar vein, featuring a different myth and different characters, obviously. And I really enjoyed KKE. I loved how just like readable it was. It was very like high energy and quite fast paced. In a lot of ways, it sort of reminded me of the reasons that I enjoyed Daughter of the Moon Goddess, but it felt a bit more refined and a bit more intentional overall. And so I'm just really excited to read more from this author, experience more of her work, experience more of her world building and her characters and her deconstruction and exploration of women in mythology. And I thought she did such a great job with KKE in the sense that like I didn't really know a lot about the Ramayana, but like you didn't really need to in order to enjoy the book. And I'm hopeful we'll have a similar experience with this one. Next up was a book that I had like heard about beforehand and I was interested in, but I wasn't necessarily like planning to purchase it. But then I saw it come into the shop and look at this cover. A millennial turned magical girl must combat climate change and credit card debt in this delightful, witty, and wildly imaginative ode to magical girl manga. What? Are you kidding? Like all of those keywords in one tight little blurb in one sentence? It just sounds wild. And it's quite short, so I feel like it's just going to be a rompy, fun, good time. I haven't read anything else by this author, so I'm not entirely sure what to expect. This is definitely like a cover title blurb by. I'm hooked. I'm hooked. What can I say? Next up is a book I don't know a lot about, but it's a recent release here in Australia and it's a debut actually. It's called Translations, and isn't this cover just beautiful? It's one of those books that is just getting quite a lot of really positive reviews and just it feels like there's a lot of really like positive response to this book at large. I'm not sure how much of that is like a press publisher's push, but it feels a bit more organic than that. Amid a series of personal disasters, Aaliyah and her daughter Sakina retreat to rural New South Wales to make a new life. Aaliyah manages to secure a rundown property and hires a farmhand, Shep, an extremely private Palestinian man. During a storm, she drives past the town's river and happens upon a childhood friend, Hannah. Tensions rise as Aaliyah's growing bond with Shep strains her devotion to Hannah. So I don't know. I don't really know what to make from that blurb. I don't know that I necessarily would have picked it up of my own accord. Sounds like literary fiction, contemporary, and small town, rural town, different experiences and different personalities colliding. And like I said, I just heard nothing but not just like vaguely positive things, but like glowing kind of responses to this book since its publication only a month or so ago. And I just feel like that doesn't happen a whole lot in the Australian publishing sphere. I feel like there's not always as much support for new voices and new authors as there should be. And so to see one getting so much glowing praise just really excited me, I suppose. Next, I've got a couple of children's books that I picked up. I am a children's bookseller. Recently, this was a new release, How to Free a Djinn. This is by a local author, I think. She came into the shop like an hour before I started working the other day. I was so upset because I just started reading the book. I'm like 30 pages in, so I don't really have a whole lot to say yet, but if you'll remember last year, my very, very favorite book of the year was The Golem and the Genie. And like, I know that this has literally nothing to do with that, but somewhere deep in my my psyche, I've convinced myself, like every time I see a book about Jinn, I'm like, it's going to be my new favorite book. I know that's silly. I know. Don't worry. I really do. Anyway, this is about a bit of like an anxious girl who's been growing up in Sydney. Her family's from Malaysia. And right at the beginning of the book, we learn that her grandmother, who lives in Kuala Lumpur, is not very well. So she and her mother are going to move back to Malaysia to take care of her grandmother. And her grandmother has always been one of those people who has like told her all kinds of nasty, beautiful, messy, scary stories about Jinn. And pretty much as soon as our main character arrives in Malaysia, strange things start happening. So I don't know. I think it's going to be a fun middle grade. I'm looking forward to continuing. And then, of course, I had to pick up Gary Loansborough's new book. This is I'm Not Really Here. Gary Loansborough is, of course, the author of The Boy from the Mish, which is one of my favorite young adult books of all time. It's incredible. He did put out another book last year that I do have but haven't got to yet. It seemed a little bit more gritty, a little darker. This one seems like, it feels like we're returning to kind of a bit more of a space similar to The Boy from the Mish, which obviously, of course, I'm looking forward to. Basically, I think it's about a new boy moving to a small town and he's joining the footy team and he's got a crush on one of the other footy players. Emotionally compelling, honest and warm, I'm Not Really Here is a beautiful novel about navigating family and friendships and finding a way through grief towards love from an internationally acclaimed best-selling Indigenous author. And Will Kostakis has described it as a lightning bolt to the soul, a bold, necessary new talent. Fuck yeah, Gary Loansborough is incredible and I can't wait to read this. Okay, now another book that I did buy from the children's bookstore in kind of like the young adult graphic novel section was Palestine by Joe Sacco. Now you probably know this. This has become a bit of a classic. And I feel like as somebody who like clearly cares a lot about Palestine, has read a lot of books on Palestine, you would think that I have read this, but I haven't. I've been meaning to pick it up, but I just kind of never get around to it because it is a little pricey and usually we only have one in stock and I like would prefer somebody else to pick it up. But one day we had a couple of copies, so I decided it was finally my time. And I made the purchase. So I've heard nothing but good things about this. Like it is a little bit of an older book at this point, but I still feel like I'm going to get a lot out of it. And you know, I love a good graphic novel. So I feel like this doesn't really need me to say much more about it, but hopefully quite soon I will finally be able to say that I have read this graphic novel. Okay, and then yesterday actually, these books are in no order, can you tell? I went into the grown-up store, which is next door to the children's bookstore that I work in, to pick up Samar Sabawi's new book, Cactus Pear for My Beloved. Samar is a like intellectual and journalist and like academic who lives here in Australia. I've been following her for a couple of years now. I love her. I've been to a couple of her talks like online. I think I even featured her in a video a few months ago, her on a panel talking with like Randa Abdul Fattah and a couple of other people. She's incredible is what I'm saying. She's incredible. And this is essentially like a memoir or like biography sort of Samar, it sounds like, but it's more focused on like the story of her family over the last 100 years. The journey of a family over the past 100 years, starting in Palestine under British rule and ending in Redland Bay, Queensland. Filled with love for land, history, peoples, it is a family story and a love story told with enormous humanity and feeling. So just one of those books that like I am interested in reading, I feel like I should read, but also by an author that I already follow, admire, and care a lot about. While I was there, I saw that Akwaeke Emezi has a new book. So of course I picked this up too. This is Little Rot, and honestly I knew nothing about it. I just saw the name and you know I was gonna leave with this book. I think I've read 3 books by Akwaeke Emezi now. I've read Freshwater, which I was kind of in awe of, but also I personally found a little bit triggering, a lot triggering. So I didn't really enjoy it, even if I did admire it, if that makes sense. I loved The Death of Vivek Oji when I read that. It was one of my favorite books of the year. And then their romance book was a bit of a mixed bag. It was wild and I definitely had my criticisms of it. But I suppose Akwaeke Emezi is just one of those authors that I admire so much, and I feel like every single book has its own flavor and has such unique approach to narrative and prose. Akwaeke Emezi is just one of those writers that is like unlike any that I've read from. So I think regardless of whether I love a particular, like an individual book, I will continue to want to read from this author. Apparently, this exhilarating new novel follows 5 people over the course of a weekend, which will brutally upend all their lives. Honestly, I kind of want to go into this with very few expectations and with almost no prior knowledge, so I'm not even going to read the rest of the blurb. Just know, I'm excited to get to this. Then maybe one of my other really highly anticipated books of the year is Towards Eternity. This is by Anton Hur. And I think this is Anton Hur's debut novel, but I mean, many of us will know Anton Hur's name because he's translated a heap of books. And this is like a sci-fi story about AI. Towards Eternity explores the unexpected consequences of progress, what we really have to fear from technology and the future, and how love and the resilience of memory might survive even the end of humanity. It's a pretty short book, but I just know I'm in for it. And so I'm just really excited to read like an original work by him. I can't wait. Next, I ordered in a poetry collection. This is called Desecrated Poppies by Yafa. And I'm just now forgetting where I first heard about this, because this was a book that I special ordered in. But I mean, I have been known to enjoy a bit of poetry from time to time, so I'm looking forward to this. Currently, there are 557 anti-trans bills across 42 states in the US, along with 45 national bills aiming to block trans people from any and all human rights. Additionally, there are 293 anti-Palestinian bills. These bills share many commonalities. They impact far more people than just the targeted identities listed on them and are crafted by the same individuals. They collectively propel us towards fascism. The same trend can be observed with Cop Cities, anti-abortion bills, and numerous other initiatives propelled forward by the Christian white nationalists. The blurb continues, but it ends with, "A world beyond fascism exists, and we hold the pathway forward." Pretty powerful blurb, to be honest. I think this is going to be some pretty intense, thought-provoking poetry. There's, I think, a couple of essays in here as well, or maybe they're just longer poems, I'm not sure. But I will find out and I will report back. Okay, we're getting to the end because like you can't even see the pile anymore. We've got 3 more books, I think. Firstly, this one is The Golden Mole by Katherine Rundell. Now, you might remember, I think it was last year. It was last year. Impossible Creatures by Katherine Rundell was my favorite children's book of the year. Such a good middle grade fantasy. I can't get over it. And I've been meaning to read more from Katherine Rundell. I have a couple of her other middle grades on my shelf that I need to get to. But also, this book came out. And this one's like a non-fiction kind of, maybe like creative nonfiction is a good way to put it from what I can tell. And my colleague at work loved this, so it came highly recommended. A gorgeously illustrated collection of the lives of some of Earth's most astounding animals, The Golden Mole is a chance to be awestruck and love-struck, to reckon with the beauty of the world, its fragility, and its strangeness. And yeah, basically, there's just a whole bunch of chapters or essays, whatever you want to call them, about a whole bunch of different creatures, and like they come with really cute little pictures too. I feel like this is probably going to read a little bit more like her essay that I read earlier in the year. Something like why you should read children's books even though you're so old and wise. Obviously that was non-fiction. It was an essay about, you know, the value of children's literature. But I loved the way that she interwove like her own experience with a little bit of history, a bit of politics, as well as a bunch of just like really beautiful quotes from a bunch of children's books and children's authors. I feel like it's going to have like a similar vibe and a similar reading experience, but instead of like celebrating children's literature, we're instead celebrating the strange, wonderful creatures of Earth. And I just really love her writing, so I'm looking forward to this. Next, we have a non-fiction book that I picked up a little while ago, and honestly, I should have included it in my recent video recommending autistic books. Not because I've read it yet, but like at the end of that video, I told you about a bunch of books that I have on my shelf that I want to read. And one of the most recent books that I've picked up on the topic of autism, neurodivergence, all of that good stuff is The Empire of Normality, Neurodiversity and Capitalism. Beyond simplistic narratives of normativity and difference, this groundbreaking book exposes the very myth of the normal brain as a product of intensified capitalism. Neurodivergent liberation is possible, but only by challenging the deepest logics of capitalism. Empire Normality is an essential guide to understanding the systems that shape our bodies, minds, and deepest selves, and how we can undo them. So I'm just really looking forward to this. I feel like I've read like quite a handful of like autistic and neurodivergent memoirs. I've read some more of those like personal experiences and reflections. And I've even read some of the more like diagnostic or self-helpy kind of books, and I found them all interesting. And and useful in varying degrees. But the book that I have loved the most is Neuroqueer Heresies by Nick Walker. And I think the thing that I loved so much about that was the fact that it challenged so many kind of systems of normality that like I have internalized and that I experience, that we all experience to varying degrees. I suppose I'm just somebody who like, yes, I want to understand my own self and I want to like better understand like how my brain works and all of that sort of stuff. But I'm also somebody who's always going to want to understand the wider context. And I'm always going to be somebody who wants to blame capitalism for all of my problems. So this seems like the perfect book for me. Jokes aside, I tend to really appreciate books that can kind of like challenge these systems, especially in our modern world, particularly in the West and under, you know, pathology paradigms and all of that stuff, where our experiences are so individualized. I really appreciate books and resources that allow me to kind of like recontextualize all of that and to understand it from a broader perspective. So I'm really looking forward to this. I think it's going to be like a little more dense, a little more difficult to get through, but I think it's probably going to be very valuable and very thought-provoking. Finally, we have a book that has been on my list for a long time. You might remember years ago, I read a book that I have long described as one of my favorite graphic novels of all time. It's a manga. It's Furari by Jiro Taniguchi. Fucking loved that book. Still love that book. Obsessed. I've since read a handful of his other books. Some of them I haven't really liked, but another one that I really loved was The Guardians of the Louvre. Through kind of like researching more about Jiro Taniguchi, wanting to read more of his stuff, I discovered that there was actually like a whole series of books and graphic novels or mangas commissioned by the Louvre. And some of them just don't look all that interesting or appealing to me. But obviously the Jiro Taniguchi one was. I loved it, highly recommend. And there was one other in that series called Cats of the Louvre by Taiyo Matsumoto. This is a mangaka I haven't read from before, but I mean, come on, that title alone, are you kidding? This one's a much chunkier volume than Guardians of the Louvre was. Also, I don't think there's any colored pages. Guardians of the Louvre, we had some really, really beautiful, colorful images as well. But obviously manga is usually just black and white. Obviously being quite like part of a special collection kind of thing. And also like this is a beautiful, beautiful hardback. These books aren't cheap. This one was about $50, which is why I've always kind of put off picking it up for myself. But one day we had it in the shop. One day we had it in the shop and I don't know, some money was burning a hole in my pocket and I wanted to buy myself a book. And this seemed like the right choice. Like I said, it's one that I wanted for a long time. Also, I just like, look at this, look at the spine. So cool, the design. I feel like this is just going to be a cozy, fun, maybe a bit playful, maybe a bit cheeky kind of a time. And if it's even half as good as Guardians of the Louvre, I'll love this. So there we have it. Those are all of the new books that I have picked up in the last few months that I haven't told you about yet. It's definitely quite the stack, especially considering I'm not really reading all that much at the moment, but I think there's an awful lot of like really interesting books, many by authors I haven't read from, a couple of debuts, but also some highly anticipated books by authors I've loved before. Please feel free to let me know if you've read any of these, if you recommend any, if you think I should bump any to the top of my list for when I am back in a reading mood. As always, a big thank you goes to my wonderful patrons over on Patreon, and especially big thank you to Livia, Lynette Brown, and Marie, and I will talk to you all again soon. Until then, so much love. Bye.